The land agent slid $1 across the counter to me. One. For 160 acres my husband paid for to the last penny. He smiled when he did it. He said it was for my trouble. My name is Iris Coyne. My husband, Sergeant Ellis Coyne, fell at Salerno in September of 1943. I am what the government calls a Gold Star widow. In Dunmore, Nebraska, in the spring of 1944, that word was supposed to mean something. To August Redfern's land agent, it meant a woman he could buy with pocket change. His name was Marcus Slade. He wore a clean collar and a soft smile. And in front of 11 men waiting in that land office line, he looked at me and he said, "A soldier's widow ought to take what's offered and be grateful, Mrs. Coyne." 11 men. Not one of them spoke. Not one. I did not cry. I want you to know that. I closed my hand over that dollar, and I turned, and I walked out into the cold March light. And that night, at my kitchen table, I wrote 2 letters. One went to the county recorder. The other went to a colonel in Italy I had never met. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before I go on, if a story about a paid debt and the men who thought a widow wouldn't fight for it is the kind you'd sit still for, then subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. I truly do. Now let me take you back and tell it the way it happened. I'll tell it calm, because a year has passed, and I know how it ends. But you don't. So bear with me. Ellis and I married in the spring of 1935. I was 24. He was a careful man. Not slow, mind you. Careful. He was the kind of man who wrote things down. Who kept his receipts in a cigar box, alphabetized, who read a paper twice before he signed it, and then read it a third time. I used to tease him for it. I used to say, "Ellis, the ink's already dry, you can stop staring at it." And he'd say, "Iris, the ink drying is exactly when a man ought to pay attention." I've thought about that a great many times since. We didn't have land of our own when we married. We had my mother's chickens and Ellis's back and a rented house on the edge of Dunmore with a stovepipe that leaked smoke every January. But out east of town, along Muddy Creek, there was a quarter section, 160 acres. Good bottom ground, with a fold of timber along the water and a rise on the north end where the wind broke clean. It belonged to an old man named Josiah Renner. Josiah was near 80 when we knew him. His children had gone off to the cities and left him rattling around in that big house alone. He couldn't work the ground anymore. But he loved it. He'd been born on it. And he wouldn't sell it to just anybody, because he wanted it worked, not carved up. Ellis went to him in the fall of 1937. He didn't have the money to buy it outright. Nobody in Dunmore did, not in those years. So the two of them sat down at Josiah's kitchen table and they made what's called a contract for deed. You've maybe heard the term. It's a poor man's mortgage. The seller keeps the paper title, but you work the land. You live on it, and you pay him in installments across the years, and on the day you pay the last dollar, that day, the title becomes yours. Not the bank's. Yours, the price was $2,400. In 1937, that was a fortune to us. It might as well have been the moon. They wrote it out in Josiah's own hand, both of them, and a neighbor came in and witnessed it and signed at the bottom, a man named Corbin Ash, who's since passed. Josiah kept one copy. Ellis kept one. And a third was to be carried in to the county recorder in Dunmore to be entered into the books, so the whole county would know the Coynes were buying the Renner quarter, fair and open. Remember that third copy. It matters later. Everything matters later. Ellis taught me that. We worked. Lord, how we worked. 6 years on that ground. We put in wheat and we put in corn, and one bad year we put in sorghum just to have something in the dirt. Ellis paid Josiah every fall out of the harvest. $100. $150. 1 year, a good year. 300. And Ellis wrote down every payment. Every single one. He kept a little book for it, A pocket ledger, brass at the corners, the kind a man buys for a nickel at the 5 and dime and then carries for 10 years. Every payment to Josiah went in that book, in Ellis's small square hand. The date, the amount, the balance left. Josiah signed his name beside each one in that shaky old script to say he'd received it. I have that book still. It sits on my mantle now. I'll come back to it. I always come back to it. By the summer of 1942, we owed Josiah just under $300, and that summer, Josiah Renner died in his sleep on the porch of the house he was born in. 82 years old. We buried him on a Tuesday. It rained. His estate was a tangle. Children scattered to 4 states, a lawyer in the county seat, papers going back and forth for months. But the contract still stood. A man's death doesn't erase what he signed. Ellis kept paying the estate now instead of the old man, and by the spring of 1943 there was one payment left. $240. And that same spring, the war reached down and put its hand on my husband's shoulder. Ellis was 31, old for a soldier. He didn't have to go. There were deferments a farmer could claim. But 3 of the Ash boys had gone, and the Pruitt boy and half the pews at the Methodist church had a star in the window. Ellis said he'd not be able to look Wesley in the eye someday if he'd hidden behind the plow. So he went. Wesley is our son. He was 7 then. He's 8 now. He has his father's careful eyes. Ellis reported to training camp in the summer of 1943. And from that camp, before he ever shipped overseas, he did 2 things that would decide everything, though none of us knew it then. The first thing, he mailed home the final payment. $240 sent to the Renner Estate's lawyer with a note in his own hand. The last installment. Paid in full. He wrote the date in the brass-cornered ledger before he sealed the envelope, I know, because the last line in that book is in his hand, and the ink is a little different. Camp ink, cheap and gray. Final payment. Contract satisfied. And below it, where old Josiah's shaky signature used to go, there's nothing, because Josiah was a year in the ground. So Ellis wrote in that small square hand, paid to estate, receipt to follow. The receipt did follow. I'll get to that too. The second thing Ellis did in camp, and I want you to hold on to this, because for the longest time I did not understand it. And it near broke me that I didn't. Ellis mailed his papers home in batches. He'd always kept careful papers, and from camp, with time on his hands in the evenings and a war in front of him, he sorted through everything he'd carried and sent it back in envelopes. Most of it came to me. Our marriage lines. The insurance. Wesley's birth record. But the last batch, the important batch, he called it in his letter. That one he did not send to me. He sent it to his colonel. His commanding officer was a man named Harlan Whitfield. Ellis wrote to me and said he'd sent his most important papers to the colonel. For safekeeping, because a colonel's footlocker doesn't get lost the way a private house can burn. I read that line a dozen times back then and I thought, Ellis, that's the strangest thing. Why on God's earth would you send your papers to a man in an army instead of to your own wife? I never understood why. I'll be honest with you, I was a little hurt by it. It felt like he trusted a stranger over his own kitchen. I folded that letter away and I tried not to think on it. Ellis shipped out. He wrote when he could. The letters got shorter and the postmarks got stranger, and then in September of 1943, they landed at a place in Italy called Salerno. The telegram came in October. A boy on a bicycle brought it up my lane. I was hanging wash. I remember the wooden pins in my mouth and the smell of the sheets and the boy's face, how he wouldn't look at me. How he held the yellow paper out at arm's length like it might burn him. I knew before I read it. Every woman on that road knew before she read it. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret. I don't remember the rest of that day. I remember Wesley came home from school, and I had to be the one to tell him, and I remember that I got down on my knees on the kitchen floor to do it so I could look him level in the eyes, the way Ellis would have. And then it was winter. And then it was spring. And with the spring came August Redfern. You need to understand who Redfern was, to understand what he did. August Redfern owned the Redfern Land and Cattle Company, and by 1944, he owned or leased a good third of Sowell County. He ran cattle across the sandhills to the west, and every year his range crept east quarter by quarter, gobbling up the little places the way a big fish takes minnows. When a man died, Redfern's agents were at the funeral. When a widow struggled, Redfern's money was there, soft and low, to take the ground off her hands for a song. And in the spring of 1944, Redfern bought the Renner estate. All of it. The scattered children, tired of the tangle, sold the old man's holdings to Redfern in one lot. The house, the outbuildings, and the Muddy Creek quarter, my quarter. The ground my husband paid for to the last dollar and died before he could see recorded in his name. Because that was the thing. That third copy of the contract, the one meant to go into the county books so the whole county would know, it had never been recorded. Ellis had meant to do it. He'd told me so. But the estate tangle came, and then the draft came. And a man about to ship out for a war has other things pressing on him than a walk to the courthouse. He carried the contract with his important papers instead. And he trusted, the way careful men sometimes trust the wrong thing, that the paper itself was enough. That a signed contract, witnessed, paid in full, was proof no matter whose shelf it sat on. He was right. In the end, he was right. But it cost more than either of us knew. Redfern's people went through the estate books and found no recorded sale of the Muddy Creek quarter. No entry. No deed transfer. On paper, on the county's paper, it looked as though Josiah Renner had died still owning that ground free and clear, and now Redfern had bought it fair. Redfern's position was 3 words, and he said them through his agents, and later he'd say them to my face. No paper, no sale. I had paper. I had the contract, sitting in Colonel Whitfield's footlocker in Italy. Though I didn't yet grasp, that's where it was. And I had Ellis's brass-cornered ledger, every payment logged and signed. But none of it was in the county books. And to a man like Redfern, if it wasn't in the books, it wasn't real. The offenses started small. They always do. A man like Redfern tests a fence before he leans on it. The first one came in April. I was in the kitchen, and Wesley came running up from the creek pasture, breathing hard, and he said, "Mama, there's men with a machine tearing up the corner." I went down. And there on the north corner of my quarter, the good corner, where Ellis had set the boundary stone with his own hands the summer we signed, a flat gray granite marker he'd hauled up on a stone boat and sunk 2 feet deep, there on that corner, a Redfern grading crew was cutting a road. They'd graded it right across my ground. A ranch road, to move cattle from one Redfern lease to another, straight through the northeast corner of the Coyne Quarter, as if it were open country. They'd torn out the young cottonwoods Ellis and I planted our first spring. Little trees, 6 years grown, just getting some height on them. Ripped out and windrowed and left to die. I walked up to the man running the grader. He shut it off. I asked him by whose leave he was cutting a road across my land. And he looked at me, not unkind, just tired, and he said, "This here's Redfern ground now, ma'am. You'd best take that up with the office." The man's name was Del Pruitt. He was Redfern's foreman. Older brother to the Pruitt boy who'd shipped out the same month as Ellis. He couldn't quite meet my eye when he said it. I marked that, even then. I marked it, and I put it away. Remember Del Pruitt. His conscience is in this story further on. Wesley stood beside me in that torn dirt, and he looked up at me and he said, "Can they do that, Mama? Can they just do that?" And I didn't have an answer that a boy of 8 could hold. So I said, "We'll see." Which is what you say when you don't know. That was the first offense. Private, small, witnessed only by my son and the ghosts of 6 cottonwood trees. The second came in May, and it was larger, because it had witnesses of a different kind. Spring planting was on me. I needed seed, and I needed money for seed. The way every farmer does, you borrow in the spring against the fall. I'd done it a dozen times. So I walked into the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Dunmore, where Ellis and I had banked for 9 years, and I sat down across the desk from the loan officer, a man named Harold Vance, and I asked for a seed loan against the Muddy Creek quarter. The same as always. Harold Vance would not look at me the way Del Pruitt would not look at me. There's a whole language in a man not looking at you. He shuffled some papers, he cleared his throat, and he told me that the bank could not extend a loan against the quarter, on account of, and here he used a phrase I would come to hate, a clouded title. He said there was a question of ownership. He said Redfern Land and Cattle had filed a claim on the Renner estate that included that ground, and until the matter was settled, the bank could not lend against land whose owner was in dispute. I said, Harold, my husband paid for that ground. Every dollar. I have his book with every payment in it. And Harold Vance said, I'm sure that's so, Iris. But a private book isn't a recorded deed. I'm sorry, my hands are tied. There was a line of people behind me, not 11, but 6 or 7. Neighbors, people who'd known me all my life, people who'd eaten at my table. And they heard the phrase clouded title attached to my name, to Ellis's name, and I watched it travel down that line like a cold draft under a door. By supper it would be all over Dunmore that the Coyne widow's land was in question. That maybe she didn't own what she farmed. That maybe there was something not quite right out at Muddy Creek. That's how a man like Redfern works. He doesn't have to prove you wrong. He only has to make the question hang in the air. The question does the damage. I walked out of that bank into the May sun, and I stood on the sidewalk, and I made myself breathe. And it was standing there that I remembered the letter. Ellis's letter. From camp, the one that had hurt me. I sent my important papers to the colonel, for safekeeping. I'd read it as a slight. Now, standing outside the bank with clouded title ringing in my ears, I heard it different. My important papers. Not his socks. Not his snapshots. His important papers. What does a careful man call important? What would Ellis, who read a contract 3 times, have thought worth sending to a footlocker in a war instead of trusting to a house that could burn? The contract. The witnessed contract for deed. It had to be. Where else was it? It wasn't in our house. I'd turned that house upside down after the telegram and found our marriage lines and the insurance and Wesley's birth record, the batches he'd sent me. But never that contract. Because he hadn't sent it to me. He'd sent it to the one place that couldn't be flooded or burned or claimed by a cattle company. He'd sent it to his colonel. I didn't understand why, all those months. And here, friends, is the thing I want you to sit with, because I've sat with it many nights. My husband, in a training camp, with a war in front of him, thought ahead to a day he wouldn't live to see. He thought about what could go wrong. He thought about a house fire, or a lost box, or a woman alone facing men who wanted her ground. And he took the single piece of paper that could protect his wife and his son, and he put it in the safest place a soldier knows, the footlocker of the officer he'd follow into fire. He didn't tell me why, because I think he didn't want to frighten me with all the ways the world could take that land. He just quietly, carefully, put the fine print where no man in Sowell County could reach it. I went home that night, and I found his letter, and I held it, and I wept, not from grief this time, but from being loved that carefully by a man who could no longer be thanked for it. But knowing where the paper was, and having the paper in my hand, are 2 different countries. Italy was at war. Colonel Whitfield, if he still lived, was somewhere on that broken peninsula with an army on his back. A letter to him might take weeks, months, it might never arrive at all. And I did not have months. Redfern was moving. That brings me to the worst day. The day I opened this story with. Late May, the land office. Redfern's company kept a land office on the square in Dunmore, 2 doors down from the courthouse, and it was there a person went to settle any business touching Redfern ground. I had a summons of sorts, not a legal one, just a note, delivered to my mailbox, saying that if Mrs. Coyne wished to discuss the disposition of the Muddy Creek parcel. Mrs. Redfern's agent would receive her Thursday. Disposition, as though my home were an item in an estate sale. I went. I'll tell you honestly, part of me went hoping. Part of me thought, maybe there's a decent man in there. Maybe when I show them Ellis's ledger, when they see every payment, they'll be ashamed and they'll make it right. I still believed then that an honest ledger and a paid debt were enough. That was my blind spot, and I'll own it. I believed the truth would be enough all by itself, just because it was true. The office was full. Thursday was a settling day, and there was a line of men waiting, cattle leases, water business, all manner of dealings. I counted them later, going back over it. 11 men in that line behind me, farmers and hands and one banker, men I knew. Behind the counter stood Marcus Slade, Redfern's land agent, a younger man, well-fed, with a fountain pen in his breast pocket and that soft smile that never reached his eyes. I laid Ellis's brass-cornered ledger on the counter. I opened it to the last page. I showed him the payments, 6 years of them, every one signed by Josiah Renner, and the final line in Ellis's camp hand. Paid to estate, receipt to follow. And I said, my husband paid for this ground in full. Here's the record. I only want what he paid for. Sled looked at the ledger the way you'd look at a child's drawing, politely, without seeing it. And he closed it. He reached out and he closed my husband's book with one finger, gently, and slid it back across the counter to me. He said, this is a nice keepsake, Mrs. Coyne, but it isn't a deed. There's no recorded sale. Legally, that quarter passed to the Renner estate, and from the estate to Mr. Redfern, you've no standing. I said, I have the contract. It exists. My husband kept it safe. And Sled smiled wider, and he said, then produce it. And when I couldn't say where it was, because how do you explain to a smiling man that it's in a footlocker in Italy? When I hesitated, he saw it, and he knew he had me, and he did the thing I will remember to my last hour. He reached into the till, and he took out a single silver dollar, and he set it on the counter, and with 2 fingers he slid it slowly across the wood toward me, and he said, Mr. Redfern's a generous man. For the trouble you've been to, he's willing to offer a token. Call it a settlement. Between neighbors. $1. For 160 acres. For 6 years of my husband's back. For the ground he set a boundary stone on with his own hands and died a world away from. And then Slade said the thing. He looked past me at those 11 waiting men, so they'd hear it, so it'd be a little show for the room, and he said, a soldier's widow ought to take what's offered and be grateful. Mrs. Coyne, the room went quiet. 11 men. Farmers who'd known Ellis. The banker. Men who'd stood in the same pews and buried the same neighbors. And not one of them said a word. Not one. Some looked at their boots. Some looked out the window. The silence of 11 decent men who each waited for another to be the first to speak, and so none of them ever did. I have thought a great deal about that silence. It hurt worse than Slade in some ways. Slade was bought and cruel and expected. But those were good men, and their quiet told me exactly how alone I was. A widow with a keepsake and a coin. I did not cry. I want you to remember that I did not give them that. I looked at the silver dollar sitting there on the counter, and I looked at Marcus Slade's soft smile, and something in me went very cold and very clear. And I reached out, and I closed my hand over that dollar. I took it. I think Slade thought he'd won. I saw it flicker across his face, surprise, then satisfaction. He thought I'd folded. I hadn't. I took that dollar because a paid receipt is a paid receipt, and one day I meant to hand it back to him in front of a great many more than 11 men. But that comes later. I picked up Ellis's ledger, I turned, and I walked out of that land office and into the light past all 11 of them, and I did not hurry and I did not stumble, and I did not let one of them see my face crack. I got to my truck. I sat behind the wheel. And only then, with the door shut, did I let myself shake. That was the bottom. If this were only a story about how the world treats a quiet woman alone, it would end about there, with a coin in her fist and 11 silent men at her back. But my husband was a careful man, and he had put the fine print somewhere they couldn't reach, and I was done believing the truth would fight for me on its own. I drove home. I put Wesley to bed, and I sat at the kitchen table where Ellis and I had sat 1,000 nights, and I thought it through cold, the way he'd have wanted. I was not going to beg Redfern. Begging was what Slide had staged that whole scene to make me do. I was going to fight it on paper, because paper was the only thing men like Redfern respected, and paper was the one thing, though he didn't know it, that I actually had. But I couldn't fight it alone. I needed someone who knew the law. And there was one man in Dunmore who might take a case that couldn't pay. His name was Sam Rourke. Young, 26 maybe, he'd gone to the war before Ellis, out to the Pacific to a place called Guadalcanal, and he'd come home in 1943 with a piece of his left leg gone and a limp he'd carry for life. He'd hung out a shingle as an attorney over the hardware store, and he took the small cases nobody else wanted, wills and fence lines, and he had the look of a man still hunting for something worth the leg he'd lost. I didn't know him well, but I knew he'd bled for the same war that took Ellis, and I thought maybe he'd understand what a gold star meant when a cattle company wiped its boots on one. I went to see him the next morning. I climbed those stairs over the hardware store, and I found Sam Rourke at a desk, with his bad legs stretched out stiff beside it, and I laid Ellis's brass-cornered ledger in front of him, and I told him the whole of it. The contract. The final payment mailed from camp. The unrecorded deed. Redfern. The road across my corner. The bank, and the silver dollar, and the 11 men, and the thing Slade said. Sam Rourke listened without a word until I got to the silver dollar, and when I told him that part, I watched his jaw go tight, and I watched something wake up in him, the thing he'd been hunting for. He picked up Ellis's ledger and he turned the pages slow, reading every payment, every signature. And when he got to the last line in that camp gray ink, paid to estate, receipt to follow, he set the book down very gently. The way you set down something that matters, not the way Slade had. Then he taught me the law, and I'm going to teach it to you the way he taught it to me. Because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on. A contract for deed, he said, is not like a handshake. It's a binding instrument. And here is the part Redfern was counting on nobody understanding. Under a contract for deed, when the buyer makes the final payment, title transfers to him by law. At that moment, whether or not anybody's yet walked it to the courthouse. The recording doesn't create the ownership, the recording just announces it. Ellis paying that last $240 is the thing that made the land ours. The unrecorded deed was a problem of proof, not a problem of ownership. The land was already mine. I just had to prove it. And to prove it, Rourke said, I needed one of two things. Either the recorder's filing, some entry in the county books showing the contract had once been brought in, or the signed original contract itself, witnessed, with the terms and the parties plain. Either one would stand up. The ledger alone was strong support but not proof. A man could claim I'd written it myself. But the original contract, in Josiah Renner's own hand, witnessed by Corbin Ash, that was a wall Redfern couldn't climb. Where is it? Rourke asked me. The original. And I told him. Italy, in the footlocker of Colonel Harlan Whitfield, my husband's commanding officer, mailed there from a training camp by a careful man who thought ahead to a day like this one. Rourke was quiet a moment. Then he said, Then we've got to get it here. And we've got to buy the time for it to come. We set to work that same morning, and Rourke did two things. The first, he helped me write to Colonel Whitfield. A careful letter, laying out who I was, whose widow, and what I believed Ellis had placed in his keeping, and begging him, for the sake of a promise between soldiers, to find that batch of papers and send home the contract, and anything he could swear to about Ellis and the debt, as fast as the war would let a letter travel. I sealed it myself. I wrote the colonel's rank on it in my best hand, the way you'd address something holy. And I carried it to the post office, and I paid the airmail, and I watched the clerk drop it in the sack for the coast, and I stood there thinking, that letter has to cross an ocean and a war and come back, and I don't know if the man is alive to receive it. The second thing Rourke did was the thing that saved us, though it cost us dear later, and he warned me of both. He filed a formal notice with the county land board. He put Redfern and Redfern's lawyers on written notice that the original witnessed contract for deed existed, that it was in safekeeping and would be produced, and that Iris Coyne was formally contesting Redfern's claim to the Muddy Creek quarter. He made it official, on paper in the record, so that no ruling could be made in the dark, so they'd have to hold a hearing, so they'd have to look at it. I asked him if we ought to keep it quiet instead, keep them from knowing we were coming. And Rourke looked at me and said, no, if we stay quiet, they rule while your back's turned, and it's over. The notice forces a hearing. It buys us the one thing we need, which is time for that letter. But, and here he leaned forward on that bad leg, understand, Iris. The minute Redfern knows the contract exists, he knows exactly what beats him. And a man like Redfern, told what beats him, will move heaven and earth to get his ruling before that paper can cross the water. We're not just racing the mail now. We're racing him. And he's got money, and he's got the recorder, and he's got a county that half belongs to him. I said I understood. I said file it anyway. Because I'd tried the quiet way, the grateful way, the way Slade staged for me, and it had bought me $1 silver. I was done being quiet. Rourke filed the notice on a Monday. Word reached the Redfern land office by Wednesday. And I heard, later, exactly how August Redfern took it. He was in his office with Slade when the news came that the widow had lawyered up and given formal notice of an original contract held for safekeeping. And Redfern, I'm told, didn't even look up from his ledger. He just laughed, one short breath through his nose, and he said 7 words. Let her mail Italy. It'll be June. He meant that by the time any letter could reach a colonel at the front and any answer could come home, the whole business would be long settled in his favor. He was counting on the war itself to be his ally. On the ocean. On the slowness of an army's mail. He thought time was on his side. He was almost right. But he'd made his mistake already, the one his kind always makes. He'd assumed no paper survived, because none was in his reach. He'd assumed a widow would fold. And in his certainty, he'd said his 7 words in front of Marcus Slade and a clerk and a foreman named Del Pruitt. And men who talk carelessly in front of witnesses leave a trail, and this county, before that summer was out, would learn to read it. That was where the ground shifted. Up to that point I had only suffered, the road, the bank, the coin. But now I had a lawyer and a mailed letter racing a war and a boundary I meant to defend. Now I was the one who'd made a move, and Redfern would have to answer it. There's a moment coming, and I'll leave you here on the edge of it, because it was the moment I stopped being a woman waiting for the world to be fair and became a woman who acted. I had Ellis's ledger. I had Rourke. I had 1 letter crossing the Atlantic with our whole future folded inside a colonel's answer. And I had a decision to make about the quarter itself, whether to keep my head down and hope, or to walk out onto that ground, past the road they'd cut through my corner, out to the boundary stone Ellis set with his own 2 hands, and plant my own notice in the earth for every man in Soule County to read. I think you know already which one I chose. But you don't yet know what it cost, or what came up that lane behind me while I was doing it. Stay with me. Because everything I've told you so far, the contract, the ledger, the coin, the colonel's footlocker an ocean away, all of it was only the setting of the stage. The reckoning hadn't started yet. I chose to walk out onto the ground. It was a Tuesday. I remember because the mail didn't run Tuesdays that spring, so there was nothing to wait on, nothing to sit by the window for. I hitched the wagon and I put Wesley up on the seat beside me and I drove out the lane to the Muddy Creek quarter. The morning was cold for May. Frost still silvered the low places. Rourke had told me what to do. A boundary notice, he called it. A plain board, my claim written on it, posted where a man couldn't miss it. It won't hold up in court by itself, he'd said. But it tells the county you're standing on this land, not hiding from it. And it tells Redfern you know exactly where the line is. I knew where the line was. Ellis said it. We drove out past the cut. That's what I'd started calling it in my own head, the cut. The road Redfern's men had graded straight through my northeast corner, the saplings Ellis and I planted torn out by the roots and windrowed like trash. Del Pruitt ran that grader. I'd watched him do it from the porch, and he hadn't once looked up the lane at the house. Past the cut, the ground rose to the corner. And there it was. The boundary stone, flat gray granite, no bigger than a bread loaf, sunk into the earth with Ellis's own 2 hands the first spring we worked the place. He'd hauled it up from the creek bed on a stone boat. He'd said, a corner ought to be marked with something that outlasts the man who marks it. They'd graded half over it. The road bit into the corner and left the stone half buried under a lip of turned dirt. The top of it just showing, gray under the frost. I got down. I knelt in the cold mud and I dug it out with my hands. Wesley came and knelt beside me and dug too, and neither of us said anything for a while. When we had it clear, I set my board in the ground astride from it, and I drove it deep with the back of the axe, and I read it out loud to my son so he'd remember it was read. This land was bought and paid for by Sergeant Ellis Coyne. It belongs to his widow and his son. The claim will be answered before the county. Then I did the other thing I'd come to do. I'd cut flowers before we left, just the early ones, the little wild plum blossoms off the tree by the well. I laid them on the stone. I did it the way I always did, the way I'd done since October of 1943. When a boy on a bicycle brought me a telegram and I learned my husband had fallen at Salerno the September before, and I hadn't even known, all those weeks, that I was already a widow while I still wrote him letters. I put the flowers on the stone. And I said the thing I said every time. I'm holding it, Ellis, I'm still holding it. Then I drove to town and I filed. Rourke met me at the courthouse. 26 years old, and he came up the steps slow, the way he always did, on the leg the Marines had left him half of at Guadalcanal. He never spoke of it, and I never asked. He carried a leather folder under his arm, and inside it was everything we had. We filed the formal claim to the Muddy Creek quarter in the name of the Coyne estate. We entered Ellis's ledger into the record as evidence, the brass-cornered pocketbook off my mantel. 6 years of payments in old Josiah Renner's hand, dollar by dollar down the pages, and the last entry in Ellis's own careful camp handwriting. $2,400. Paid in full. Renner had died in the summer of 1942, 82 years old. And the deed transfer was never carried to the county books before Ellis shipped out. That was the whole crack Redfern had pried the land through. No paper in the courthouse. No sale, he said. But there was paper. It was just an ocean away. That same afternoon I mailed the 2 letters. One to the county recorder, making the claim official on the record. And one to Colonel Harlan Whitfield, somewhere in Italy, a man I had never met, a man my husband had served under and mailed his papers to for safekeeping. I'd never understood why Ellis sent that last batch to his colonel instead of home to me. I understood now. Ellis was careful. Ellis knew a house could burn and a courthouse could lie, but a good officer keeps his footlocker locked and his word kept. I wrote to the colonel plain. I told him who I was. I told him what his sergeant had paid for and what a rich man was trying to take. I told him if my husband had ever mailed him a contract with old Renner's signature on it. That piece of paper was the difference between my son keeping his father's ground or losing it. Then I put the letter in the slot. And I stood there a second with my hand still on the cold brass door of the mailbox. Because I understood what I'd just done. I'd sent our whole future across a war, across the ocean, across the slowness of an army's mail, into the hands of a man I had to trust without knowing his face. Rourke did the last thing too, the thing he said the law required and honesty demanded. He filed a formal notice with the land board that the original signed contract existed and would be produced, and he sent written warning to Redfern's counsel of the same. He wouldn't win by ambush. That wasn't in him. I asked him if that was wise, telling them what beats them. He looked at me a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Coyne, a man who wins by hiding the truth spends the rest of his life afraid somebody'll find it. We're going to win with it in our hand, in the open, in front of everybody who watched them mock you. That's the only kind of winning worth the leg I left on that island." I heard later how Redfern took the warning. He laughed. His counsel read it to him at his big house, and he laughed, and he said 7 words, the same careless way he said everything in front of the men who worked for him. "Let her mail Italy. The war's mine." He meant the war was on his side. The ocean. The slowness. The months it took a letter to cross and come back. He thought time was his ally. And then the waiting started, and I learned what he meant. May went by. The mail ran Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and I was at the box every one of those mornings before the carrier's dust had settled. Nothing. Wesley learned to read my face by the way I walked back up the lane. Empty hands, empty face, and he'd go quiet and go to his chores without being told. I want you to understand what those weeks were. I knew, Rourke and I both knew, that one piece of paper on a boat was the whole thing. And Redfern did not know it existed. That was the only card we held, and we couldn't play it, because it hadn't come. We just had to wait and pray a mail sack somewhere on the Atlantic held our lives inside it. Redfern didn't wait. Redfern moved. First the fence. I woke one morning to my milk cow gone and the west fence cut clean, 3 strands snipped and curled back, and Redfern cattle standing in what should have been my winter wheat. Cut, not broke. A wire doesn't cut itself. I mended it alone, my hands raw on the pliers, and I said nothing, because Rourke told me saying something was what they wanted. Give them no reason. Let the paper do the talking when it comes. Then the witness. Word came to me the way word does in a small county, through my neighbor's wife, who heard it from her cousin who cooked at Redfern's. Del Pruitt, the foreman, the man who graded my corner, was going to swear before the board that he'd worked that land for Redfern's estate for years and never once seen or heard of any contract between Renner and my Ellis. Bought and paid for, a witness who'd stand up and lie under oath. I thought of Pruitt on that grader, not looking up the lane. I thought, that man knows better. And I filed it away. Then the worst of it. Rourke came to the house himself to tell me, and he came slow up the porch steps and he had his hat in his hands, and I knew before he spoke it was bad. Emmett Boyce, the county recorder, had made a statement. The office had searched, he said. There was no recorded copy of any Renner de Coyne transfer on file. If such a document had ever been submitted, it could not be found. Could not be found. I remember I laughed, and it wasn't a good laugh. Lost, I said. Or hidden. Rourke didn't answer that. He just said, Iris, I've known Emmett Boyce 20 years. That man never lost a piece of paper in his life. He files a grocery list in triplicate. And then he looked at me and he didn't say the rest, but I heard it. A man that careful doesn't lose a document. A man that careful hides one. And a man that careful keeps something back, even when he's bought. Even the crooked ones keep a stub. I held on to that. Rourke told me to. He said, we don't know how yet, but a man like Boyce leaves a thread. When it's time, we pull it. But the paper hadn't come. And then came the blow that nearly ended it. Redfern's counsel petitioned the board to move the hearing up. Cited the season, the planting, the need to settle title before summer. The board granted it. The hearing was set for June the 12th. June the 12th. Rourke sat at my kitchen table with the letter in his hand, and he did the arithmetic out loud. Quiet. And the number was against us. There was no mail in the world that crossed an ocean and came back in the days we had left. They'd moved the hearing to beat the letter. They knew now what we were waiting on, because Rourke had told them in the open, like an honest man. And Redfern had used our honesty to set the clock against us. I said, "Then what do we have on June the 12th? Rourke laid it out flat, because he never lied to me, not once. "We have the ledger. We have your testimony. We have a contract we can prove was signed and witnessed, but that we cannot physically produce. Against a recorder who says nothing's on file and a foreman who'll swear it never existed." He rubbed his face. "Iris, the ledger is strong. It might be enough. But it might not, and I won't tell you it will." I asked him the only question that mattered. If the letter comes after the 12th, if the Colonel's packet lands the 13th, is it too late? He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "If Meeks rules on the 12th and it goes against us, we appeal, and appeals take money we don't have, and years your boy can't wait through. And by then Redfern's cattle have been on that ground 2 summers, and possession starts to look like right." He met my eyes. "So we need it on the 12th. We need it in that room." We didn't have it on the 12th. I want to be honest about that, the way Rourke was honest with me. When I walked into the county land board on the morning of June the 12th, 1944, I did not have the Colonel's letter. It had not come. I'd stood at the box that Saturday and that Monday morning both. And there was nothing, and I'd driven to town with a ledger and a lawyer and a prayer and not one thing more. But I want to tell you what was in that room. Word had traveled. I hadn't asked anybody to come. But the benches were full. The whole American Legion post from Dunmore was there. The men who'd fought the last war and knew what a gold star meant, sitting straight-backed in their good shirts. Neighbors I'd farmed beside for 9 years. The preacher. Women who'd brought me pie the week the telegram came and never made a fuss of it. Corbin Ash's widow, come to sit for the husband who'd witnessed my Ellis sign and hadn't lived to say so. They filled the benches and they stood along the back wall, quiet, the way country people go quiet when something's about to be decided that they mean to witness. And there was Redfern. August Redfern himself, in a gray suit up front, easy in his chair the way a man sits when he owns the room and knows it. Sladd beside him, Marcus Sladd, the agent, the silver dollar man, with his soft hands folded. And down the bench, Del Pruitt, in a collar that didn't fit him, not looking at anybody, turning his hat in his lap. Chairman Alonzo Meeks sat the middle of the board, a fair man. Old, dry, careful. He called it to order, and he said the county was met to settle the disputed title to the Muddy Creek quarter section, and he asked who spoke for the claim. Rourke stood up on his half a leg. "I speak for the widow of Sergeant Ellis Coyne," he said. And it began, and it went the way Rourke said it might. He entered the ledger. He walked the board through 6 years of payments in Josiah Renner's own hand, dollar by dollar, and the final entry in Ellis's. He was good. He was quiet and clear, and he made those figures sing. And I watched Meeks study that ledger a long time, and I let myself hope. Then Redfern's counsel stood. And he was smooth. He held the ledger up and he said, "A private notebook. Handwriting anyone might make." He called Emmett Boyce, and Boyce came forward, gray and sweating a little, and he said under oath that the recorder's office held no filed transfer for that quarter, that he had searched, that if a document ever existed it was not in the county's keeping. He said the words could not be found, and I watched him say them, and I watched his eyes, and Rourke was right. That was not a man who'd lost a paper. That was a man carrying one. Then they called Del Pruitt. And Pruitt stood up, and he was sworn, and Redfern's counsel asked him plainly, "In your years working this land for the Redfern estate, did you ever see or hear of any contract between Josiah Renner and Ellis Coyne?" And Pruitt opened his mouth. And I saw him look at the table. There was a folded flag on the clerk's table, my Ellis's flag. The one they'd given me folded into a triangle, and Rourke had asked to place it in the record, and Meeks had allowed it. Pruitt looked at that flag, and his mouth was open and no sound came, and Redfern's counsel said, "Mr. Pruitt," and Pruitt closed his mouth. And right then, right in that silence, with a bought man staring at a dead soldier's flag and choking on the lie he'd been paid to tell, the door at the back of the room opened. Everybody turned. Country people turned slow, all together, like wheat in a wind. It was the mail carrier. Not on his route, off it, out of breath, his cap in his hand. And behind him, holding the door, a young man in an army uniform, home on furlough, who'd carried it the last miles himself when he heard where it was bound. The carrier came up the aisle with a packet in both hands, a thick brown packet, franked and stamped and creased from an ocean, and he said, loud enough for the whole room, "Begging the board's pardon, but this come this morning, and the address said the county board, and it said urgent, and it said the Widow Coin, and I judged it couldn't wait on my route." Meeks said, "Bring it forward." I couldn't move. Rourke went and took it. His hands weren't steady. He carried it to the board, and he laid it on the table, and he said, "Mr. Chairman, I'd ask the board to open this before us all, because I believe I know what it is, and I believe it answers everything asked in this room this morning." Meeks cut the string himself. He drew the papers out slow. And the room did not breathe. Redfern was still easy in his chair, but his hand had gone to the arm of it. Sled had stopped folding his soft hands. The first paper Meeks unfolded, he read to himself, and his old face changed. Then he stood. Alonzo Meeks stood up behind that table, and he read the second paper aloud, and his voice was not dry anymore. "This is a sworn affidavit," he said, "from Colonel Harlan Whitfield, United States Army, written from Italy, in the field." He read the colonel's rank again, slower, and the Legion men in the benches began to rise, not all at once. One, then another, then the whole post of them, up on their feet, hats coming off. Because those men knew what a colonel's sworn word was and what it cost a fighting man to sit down in a war and write it. Meeks read it. "I'll give it to you the way I've carried it every day since." The colonel swore that Sergeant Ellis Coyne had served under him. That Sergeant Coyne, careful man that he was, had entrusted to his commanding officer for safekeeping a document. And here Meeks lifted the next page. The old page. The one with 2 signatures and a witness line, and I knew Renner's hand across the room before I could read a word of it. A witnessed contract for deed. Josiah Renner to Ellis Coyne, the Muddy Creek Quarter, 160 acres, sum of $2,400, and marked across its face in Renner's own writing, paid in full. The original. The paper Redfern swore no man would ever find, because it was never in his reach. It had been in a footlocker in Italy the whole time, waiting on a promise between 2 soldiers. And then, Meeks read the last of it, the colonel's own account. He wrote that Sergeant Ellis Coyne, in his last hour at Salerno in September of 1943, had pulled his colonel out of a burning half-track with his own hands, and had taken the wound doing it that he died of, and that with what breath he had left he'd asked one thing of the man he'd saved. Not for himself. He asked the colonel to see that his wife held the ground, that Iris kept the quarter for the boy. Whitfield wrote, "I gave my word to a dying man who gave his life for mine. I have kept papers for the living and the dead across this whole war. I never kept any I meant to honor more than these." The room was standing, all of it. I don't remember standing, but I was standing. Wesley's hand was in mine, and I didn't remember taking it. And the folded flag was on the table, and my husband's name was in the air of that room in a colonel's sworn hand, and every man who'd watched them slide me a silver dollar was on his feet with his hat off. That was the reckoning. It had finally started. Meeks let the room settle. It took a while. Then he sat, and he set the original contract beside Ellis's open ledger, and he read them together, line for line, the recorder's own hand forced to follow along. Renner's ledger figures and the contract's terms. They matched. Every dollar. 6 years of them. 2,400 paid in full, witnessed by Corbin Ash, whose widow sat weeping in the third row, and honored now by a colonel of the United States Army. Meeks took off his glasses. He looked down the front bench at August Redfern. Then he ruled. He ruled the Muddy Creek quarter section had passed in full and lawful title to Ellis Coyne upon final payment in the fall of 1943, recording or no recording, and that title now stood vested in the Coyne estate, in the widow and the son. He ordered the deed recorded in my name that day. He ordered Redfern to restore the road he'd cut and the fence he'd broken, at his own cost, before the season was out. And then Meeks did the thing Redfern never saw coming, the thing that turned the whole board around. He said, this claim of Redfern's rested entirely on the Renner estate titles. And if the county's recording of the Coyne transfer is to be questioned, then the county has cause to question every Renner title Mr. Redfern has recorded to himself. He looked at the board on either side of him, and he said, I move we open a review of the Redfern estate recordings. All of them. Forthwith, it carried. Just like that. The man who'd stood in front of the whole county saying no paper, no sale, it was his paper, now, that had the cloud on it. His grab was the one with the bad title. I watched August Redfern take that. He didn't say a word. He'd said all his words already, careless, in front of witnesses, and the county had learned to read the trail. He stood up. He picked up his hat. And that proud man walked out of that room the whole length of it, past every neighbor and every Legion man still on his feet, and not one of them sat down to let him by easy, and not one of them said a word to him, and the silence they gave him was worse than anything they could have shouted. He went out the door the mail had come in. And I heard later he sold out of the county before the frost, and nobody knew where he went, and nobody asked. But the board wasn't done, and neither was I. Meeks called Marcus Slade forward, the silver dollar man. And Rourke stepped up and asked the board to enter one item into evidence of the manner in which the Redfern Company had dealt with a Gold Star widow. And I opened my hand. I'd carried it every day. That single silver dollar, the one Slade slid across the counter in the land office for the trouble, the one I'd closed my hand over and never spent. I set it on the clerk's table, next to the flag, next to the contract. $1. The whole worth they'd put on my husband's land and my husband's life. Slade went the color of paste. Meeks asked him if he'd offered the widow of Sergeant Coyne $1 in settlement of a claim to a 160-acre farm paid for in full. And Slade stammered. He said he'd only done as he was told. He said the words a small man says. I only did as I was told, Mr. Chairman. I only carried Mr. Redfern's offer. And Meeks looked at him one dry moment and said, Then you carried it poorly, and told him to sit down. That was all. A small man got a small ending, and it fit him. Then Rourke turned to Emmett Boyce, and this is the part I'd been waiting for since the day Rourke told me a careful man keeps a stub. Boyce was still on the stand, gray, sweating through his collar. Rourke said, Mr. Boyce, you testified the office holds no filed transfer for this quarter. Boyce said that was so. Rourke said, You testified it could not be found. Boyce said, That's what I said. And Rourke reached into his leather folder, slow, the way he did everything, and he drew out a single small slip of yellow paper. He'd found it. He'd gone through the office's own filing stubs, the little receipt slips the recorder tears off and keeps when a document's submitted, the ones a careful man files in triplicate even for a grocery list, and there it was. A stub. Dated, numbered, Renner to Coyne, Muddy Creek Quarter, received and filed. In Emmett Boyce's own hand. The document wasn't lost, Rourke said. It was submitted. It was received. It was filed. Here's the stub, in your writing, for the copy your office says it cannot find. He set it down. A document isn't lost when the man who logged it kept the receipt. It's hidden. And the man who hides county records and swears to it under oath has undone himself with his own paperwork. Boyce didn't have a word. His whole crooked care had turned in his hand like the wire fence, cut clean by the very thing he trusted. Meeks referred him for removal from the office that afternoon, undone by his own triplicate. There's a justice in that I still think about. Last was Pruitt, and Meeks, being a fair man, gave the foreman the chance to finish his testimony now that the truth was standing in the room. He said, "Mr. Pruitt, you were asked whether you ever knew of a contract on that land. Do you wish to answer?" And Del Pruitt stood up. And he looked at the flag on the table again, and this time he didn't choke on it. Something in him cracked right there in front of the whole county, and I watched it happen, and I've never been sorry I did. He said, "I graded that road across her corner. Redfern told me to, and I did it. And I dug out the saplings her and her man planted." He stopped. His voice went. "And I seen the boundary stone," he said. "I graded half over it. I knew whose it was. Coyne set that stone. Everybody in this county knew Ellis Coyne farmed that quarter 6 years and paid old Renner every spring. I knew there was a contract. I was going to stand here and say I didn't." He looked at me then, first time since the porch, and he said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Coyne. I got no excuse. I knew." His conscience cracked in public, in the open, where he'd have to live in the same county with it. I'll tell you I forgave him, because he told the truth when the lie would have held. Not everybody in that room forgave him. But I did. Ellis would have. And the bank. Word travels, and money travels fastest of all. Before that day was out, Harold Vance, the loan officer at the Farmers and Merchants, who'd turned me away that spring citing a clouded title. A title clouded by nothing but Redfern's lie, sent word to the courthouse that the bank would be pleased to extend Mrs. Coyne her seed money whenever she cared to call. The same money. The very loan he'd refused. $240 for seed, denied to a widow in March, offered to a landowner in June, the land no different. Only the truth of it now standing in the county record where every man could read it. I'd warned that bank in writing, back when Rourke filed. I'd told them the title was clean and would be proven. Vance chose the safe side and the wrong side. Now he got to live with having read the fine print too late. I took the loan. Ellis paid every dollar he ever owed a man, and I meant to plant his ground, and I wasn't too proud to farm with the bank's money. But I never banked with a smile at Harold Vance again, and he never expected me to. That was the reckoning. Every face, one at a time, in the same room, in front of the same men who'd watched them mock me. Redfern walked out into nothing. Sladd sat down small. Boyce undone by his own care. Pruitt broken open and honest at last. The bank turned around by supper time. And a colonel's sworn word, and my husband's careful hand, and a flat gray stone he set in the earth that outlasted every man who tried to grade over it. I walked out of that courthouse holding my son's hand and the deed to my land and the folded flag and the little brass ledger. And on the top step, in the June sun, I did the last thing I'll tell you I did that day. I looked at the silver dollar in my other hand. Meeks had given it back to me, entered and returned, and I closed my fingers over it the same way I had in the land office. But it wasn't the same. In the land office it was a wound. Now it was mine. And it was paid for like everything else. Let me tell you where it all sits now. It's spring again, a year on, and I'm telling you this calm because time and a fair county have let me be calm. The Muddy Creek quarter is in wheat. 160 acres of it. Green and moving in the wind clear out to the boundary stone, and the stone stands clear now, dug out and set right, and the roads filled back in where Redfern's men filled it, at Redfern's cost before he left. Wesley's 8 now, 8.5, and he's learning the tractor. Sits up on it too proud, works the clutch with both feet because his legs don't reach. And I let him. Because his father would have let him, and because it's his ground now, deeded in his name to come. The deed's framed on the wall of the front room. I hung it beside the folded flag. The two of them together, because that's the truth of what that land cost, paid once in silver and once in blood. The brass-cornered ledger sits on the mantel below them, 6 years of a man's honest figures. And I dust it every week and I don't put it away, because a ledger like that ought to be where a boy can pick it up and read his father's careful hand. And the silver dollar, I'll tell you what I did with the silver dollar. I nailed it up over the barn door, right over the middle of it, where I see it every morning going out and every evening coming in. My one dry joke. They put $1 on my Ellis, so I hung their dollar over the barn like a horseshoe, for luck, and every time I pass under it I think, that's what a lie is worth, $1. And here's what the truth was worth. All this ground and all this wheat and this boy on this tractor. It makes me smile. Ellis would have laughed out loud. They're all gone, the ones who did it. Redfern sold out and left the county before the first frost, and the review of his titles ran on without him, and other families got back ground he'd taken the same crooked way, so my fight fed a few more. Slide left the land office that summer. Nobody would sign a paper across his counter after they'd heard how he'd slid $1 at a Gold Star widow. Boyce is gone, removed, his triplicate filed away by an honest man now. Del Pruitt stayed. He works his own small place east of town, and when we pass on the road he lifts his hat to me, and I lift my hand to him. Because a man who tells the truth when the lie would have paid is a man worth the road he shares with you. And Rourke, Sam Rourke, got his one clean fight, the one he said was worth the leg he lost. He wouldn't take but half his fee. Said the other half he'd bill me when Wesley made his first crop. He comes to Sunday dinner sometimes, comes up the porch slow on that half a leg and never says a word about it, and Wesley worships him, and that's a fine thing to watch. There's one more letter. It came this spring, from home this time, from Ohio, no ocean under it. Colonel Harlan Whitfield is home. He wrote to say he'd made it back, and that he'd carried a promise the whole way, and now that he was home and free, he meant to keep the last of it. He asked if he might come to Nebraska this summer and stand at the boundary stone Ellis set. He wants to see the ground he swore for. He wants to meet the boy. I wrote back yes. I wrote, come in July when the wheat's gold, and stand at the northeast corner where my husband put that stone down with his own 2 hands, and I'll show you the man's whole life laid out in a straight green line. And I'll put flowers on the stone the way I do, and you can tell my son how his father spent his last hour saving you and thinking of us. So that's the story. A rich man and a captured county and a widow they thought would fold. They read every advantage but the one that mattered. They never read the fine print, and the fine print was a careful man's word, and a soldier's promise, and 6 years of honest figures in a little brass book. What's paid for in full can't be taken by men who never bothered to read. Ellis paid for that ground twice, once in silver and once in blood. All they ever brought was $1. I told you at the start I'd tell you what it cost and what came up the lane behind me. It cost a winter of standing at an empty mailbox and a morning in a courtroom with nothing in my hands but a book and a prayer. And what came up the lane behind me was the whole county, on its feet, hats off. And a colonel's word crossing an ocean to land in the one room where it could save us. I'm still on the ground, I'm still holding it, and I always will. If you've stayed with me this far, then you're the kind who reads the fine print too, and I'm glad of you. Tell me the town you're watching from, down below. I'd like to know how far my Ellis's story has traveled.